you settle down there over there, Charles, man. He's making a mess of my studio. He's disturbing the producer with all of his background noise. I tell you, there's no controlling this guy. That's right. Charles Goldman in the studio with me tonight as we talk. Would you like food stamps with that farm subsidy? Well, apparently for somebody it's one or the other, and they can't get their minds around the possibility that maybe at one point or another, one helps somebody and one helps somebody else. But it's not just Steve King who thinks it's a good idea to cut $20 billion from the food stamp program. There's a lot of people out there, and a lot of you have been writing to me today. Who don't like food stamps.
The email has been flying furiously today.
Yeah, nice pun. I like that. Anytime you can string two F words together, I'm happy about that. Yeah,
we'll do a little more alliteration later.
Alliteration within the confines of what the FEC allows for community-owned radio stations. Because this show is not only available online at FallonForum.com every Monday through Thursday, 6 to 6 p.m., but it's available on KHOI 89.1 FM in Ames every Wednesday at 5 p.m., and also up in KPVL country, that's Northeast Iowa, at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays. But right now we're talking with Charles Goldman, and we're talking about the food stamp program. Some people don't like it much.
Yeah, I was surprised by the venom of some of the email you received as to how much people feel envious of those who are being given on average $1.40 a day to spend on food.
$1.40 a day versus the $1.2 million that Steve King and his son landed in farm subsidies over the past 16 years.
Well, I mean, I think it's worth a little history before we go onward. And that is that the juxtaposition of the farm subsidy bill and the food stamp bill is actually a legacy of the old style politics of log rolling. Although people, of course...
Log rolling, we don't do that anymore in politics?
Well, no, because we don't ever negotiate anything.
Right, okay.
People may not remember, sort of like the abortion issue, people don't remember women dying from abortions that were done outside medical facilities. But in the 60s, there was a trip that Robert Kennedy took actually to Appalachia and the Deep South, in which he encountered children who looked very much like the children you probably see on those late-night TV shows, late-night ads, those infomercials for, support a child in some African
I've heard
country.
them referred to as fly-faced babies.
Correct. The ones who, like the Biafran children,
right.
Bloated bellies, stick arms and legs. In fact, that was not an unusual circumstance in impoverished portions of the United States in the 1960s.
And not just rural, more rural than urban.
Mostly rural in Appalachia and the Deep South. That's the genesis of food stamps. 12 years later, a physicians group went back to the same areas they'd been in the mid-60s and said that although poverty was still just as rampant, the malnutrition and the basic vitamin deficiencies that you read about, maybe in high school biology, and you think it only happened like on, British warships in the days of, sail, had been mostly eradicated in these areas. Well,
we can't have any of that.
Well, the problem is that to get the food stamp program continued, they had to bargain with the agricultural interests that did not, the rural states that had no particular interest in this.
Who were a lot more powerful.
Well, they're equally powerful because of the way the Senate's set up.
Okay, sure.
So in the 60s, basically the compromise was that the urban areas that wanted food, the urban representatives that wanted food stamps, agreed to vote for the farm subsidies bill. If
poverty has been an issue affecting rural areas, Appalachia, southern areas, then you would think there'd be some states that might have a joint issue.
Well, you
joint
would think
interest, cotton subsidies,
but
for example.
Historically, that wasn't the case. Historically, the way that the reason these two bills were put together was to make sure it had bipartisan support, which it had up until recently. And then, of course, we have this Congress. And one of your emails actually was very on spot, which is the question is, why are the Republicans in particular so vehement about this program?
Vehemently against
the food stamp program. And of course, when you put it against what they're voting for, along with the Democrats in the Farm Bill, we can talk about the ludicrousness of this. But basically, they've done nothing. I mean, the Tea Party said they were going to come to Washington and they were going to, gut the government and cut all the fat.
Do you want me to breathe a sigh of relief now or after the program's over?
Well, of course. I mean, that's good because we talked about last week. They don't really want to govern. But this was an area that they thought they had a winner. This goes right back to Ronald Reagan.
They thought they had a winner in cutting food stamps.
Absolutely. Because remember Ronald Reagan? What did Ronald Reagan call people on welfare?
I am blanking now.
Welfare queens.
Welfare queens.
Welfare
yes,
queens
yes,
talked about the young studs, i.e., black men,
Right.
eating T-bone steaks on food stamps. That's their saint, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, that's the stereotype put forth to justify
Exactly.
eliminating the program.
So
again,
this-
totally forgetting the folks that the scenario you mentioned where food stamps helped eradicate the prevalence of extreme poverty and malnourishment.
Well, let's just get the facts out there because obviously our legislators are unconcerned with the facts. 1/3 of the people who get food stamps are white, 20% are black, 50% are children.
50% of children.
Yeah, another third are disabled or elderly. Or, as some of your listeners point out, military people, people who work for Walmart, the working poor.
Yeah, nearly 53 million in food stamps has been cashed by folks eligible to shop in base commissaries, meaning that includes disabled veterans. Base commissaries, that means military base commissaries.
Right.
That includes disabled veterans, others with military ID that entitles entrance to the facilities. 53 million. But you don't hear, that's not the poster person.
No, the poster person is Surfer Bob or whatever his name was out in Santa Cruz, where he was buying lobster and sushi with his food stamps.
It was the welfare queen, and before that, it was more. It was the low income urban black who, again, it was okay to hate that person years ago. You can't get away with that as much anymore. So now we're turning to Surfer Bob.
Well, read the second page of that article in which they talk to one of the retired military who disabled, has gotten 2 children through college, has 3 other kids at home. And he asked the question of, why is everyone so angry about this program?
This is Butch Griggs. He's a disabled vet, father of 5, who relies on food stamps. He says, quote, at 25%, it's just huge. That's the cut he's talking about.
Correct.
He's
25% of $1.40 takes you down to just barely over $1.
Yeah, and that's a huge cut. He's a former Marine. He served in the 1980s and said he suffers from bipolar disorder and a ruined disc in his back. He says, quote, that's
which I'm sure, according to many people, he's faking, right?
Right, because you couldn't possibly injure your back in war.
Well, anyway.
Right. How could you, what could you be doing that would possibly injure your back in a military situation, really? So he's obviously faking, and I'm obviously being sarcastic. He says, quote, that's a lot compared to what I have to work with. What it means is basically no food security whatsoever. It means you're having to ask and scrounge and beg for extra food. He's a single parent. He's now a single parent after his ex-wife, who suffered severely from diabetes, died of cardiac arrest a year ago. And in spite of both parents' problems, they got their oldest daughter through college last year. That sounds pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg's got his 18-year-old son enrolled in college this week. Yeah. So
and he's got 3 more kids. And then he asked the question at the bottom, which is most critical. He says, why should the children in this country suffer for the errors of their parents?
Yeah.
You know, and again,
he doesn't fit the right-wing poster title that they want us to beat up on in order to cut this program. So, I mean, why are those who hate food stamps content to ignore the facts, to ignore the reality, to not look at the broad spectrum of who receives these stamps, including the 53 million spent? I mean, and that's just the amount spent at military establishments, military commissaries. Who knows how much beyond that military personnel, veterans, disabled veterans perhaps, receiving food stamps spent at other locations.
Well, this is the argument. Okay, number one, there's tons of fraud in this program. It turns out that may represent, about 1% of the program. Second, there are people who are getting benefits that are excessive or that should have been stopped because their income had increased. One of the cases they point to is a gentleman in Michigan who won the lottery and was still getting his food stamps. That probably represents another 2 to 3% of the people. So you still have 95% of the people justifiably getting this. The other thing that happened was the amount spent on food stamps doubled during the Obama administration. So the natural assumption is, well, people must be cheating, or else people who really don't need it are getting it.
That's a no-brainer. I mean, the economy
of course.
That's a no-brainer.
The economy tanked in 2008.
How many of you have a no-brainer comment to add to this conversation? Or maybe you think we're wrong. I mean, it is possible that at least one of us likely to be Charles, is wrong. So give us a call if you'd like at 515-244-0077, 244-0077. Or if you're calling from a military establishment in the South and you'd like to use our toll-free number, it's 855-244-0077. Let's go to
a special red state line.
Let's go to Ron Yarnell. Ron, welcome to the show.
How you doing, Ed?
Good.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
All right. Here's the answer to your question. Why people don't like food stamps? Why people won't accept facts? Because there's a basic moral equation at work. Poor people need to be punished.
Poor people need to be punished.
Right.
Well, can't we just
Rich
wait till the
people need to be
afterlife for that to
rewarded.
happen?
Poor people need to be punished.
No,
That's
poor
the
people are just
basic
more easy to
operative
punish
moral
politically.
equation here.
I'm not sure. What do you think, Charles?
I don't think they see it that way. I think what's happened is that we live in a time in which there's no sense of, for lack of a better term, noblesse oblige, which is that you have some responsibility to others. Instead, what you see like an email that you got, right? Somebody says, I'm working hard, and I see somebody at the QT buying stuff with food stamps, and that bothers me. Why does it bother you? Would you really trade your life for somebody who needs to subsist on food stamps? The other question is, as Paul Krugman has said, we're a nation of moochers. Everybody else thinks that everyone else is getting all this money, and they're not. Well, that person who saw the person at the QT, do you take a mortgage interest deduction on your income tax? Maybe you're a person who lives where Hurricane Sandy hit in New York, and the federal government is basically putting everything back up at the cost of everybody else. If you're that person, you think, well, I have a right to that. Why do you have more right to that than the $1.40 a day we're offering to these people so they can eat? And really, how much of it is out of your hide to see people fed?
Yeah, Ron, I guess I'm your comment on people feel the poor should be punished. I'm not wrapping my
we got a really bad connection here that's going in and out.
I'm not sure why. I don't think it's on our end, but it could be. My problem is I know that there is some contempt for the poor because you consider that the poor, well, they must be that way because they're lazy. They're not trying hard enough. I worked hard and I got my butt in gear and I succeeded.
Because I think the moral equation is what pushes it. But people are wrestling with the fact that there's no more social mobility, so we're all a lot closer to the poor than we are to the rich. I mean, social mobility has ceased in this country. It's ceased for a generation.
That's correct, Ron, because the biggest predictor of where you will be economically is where do you come from. And if you're poor to start with, you end up poor in this country. And the notion of social mobility, economic mobility in this country is a joke. We're one of the least economically mobile countries right now in the world.
And we used to be more so. It's shifting and
no, it's worse.
Yeah,
I mean,
thing.
But the thing is, here again, I mean, this is no different than what happened in the 1960s. What happened in the 1960s? The Democrats said, we are going to correct some of the ailments of the past and help African Americans through affirmative action to have some social mobility. The people who resented it the most were the veterans who came back, used the GI Bill to go to college so that they were now the white middle class in the 50s. And they were highly resentful because it was somebody else's turn. And that's sort of the way it is in the United States right now, which is people seem to forget where they come from. And the other flip side of this is there's a certain amount of evangelical theology now, which is fed to them in the mass churches, which is that if you are rich, that's because God has favored you.
Well, that's not new. That's nothing new about that.
But it's
that
very
goes
much
way
a part
back.
of the mega church movement.
Right, but it goes way back. It has its roots way back.
But it's very much a reflection of the acquisitive and consumerist nature of this country.
We've taken it to a new
level. So if you're poor, it's because God has disfavored you. And that's...
I would disagree, but I wouldn't put too much on the religious angle because historically evangelicalism has been the prime mover behind progressive politics in this country. The religious angle only comes in the last generation as a backlash to the religious angle to the civil rights movement.
No, but that's true. But if you look a year or two ago on Time magazine cover, it certainly made this point in a very good article about what's really being taught people who are affluent in this country, and it's what justifies them saying, "Well, I don't see why we have a problem with a 30% profit margin." and we'll fight anything that takes 1 or 2% out of that.
Ron, thanks for the call.
All right.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah. Well, what amazes me though is again the disconnect. And again, I understand why these are in the same bill. It's called the Farm Bill, but it really should be called there's a movement afoot. There are a lot of people who are calling it the Farm and Food Bill. And there's just as there are folks like Steve King who would just as soon do away with the food stamp program. There are a lot of people who think that farm subsidies either need to be eliminated or need to undergo a massive overhaul.
Well, it's really funny because farm subsidies are an easy target. The right hates them, the left hates them, the environmentalists hate them.
Well, not the farmers on the right or left.
No.
they like them well
The
enough.
only people who like them are the wealthy farmers. 80% of the benefits of this bill go to 10% of the farmers.
And that's not how it was originally conceived when Henry Wallace crafted the farm relief program back in the Depression.
Right. I mean, here, I have two things from the American Enterprise Institute. When was the last time we quoted the American Enterprise Institute except to make fun of it? Okay? July 17, 2013. Like the past ones, Farm Bill 2013 is an American boondoggle. So they point out some things here, which, price loss coverage is going to lock in the prices that farmers are going to be able to be subsidized to at the historically high levels they are now. Not some average over 50 years, the high level. How much is that going to cost? $18 billion. The International Food Disaster Program. What's the requirement in this bill? That the food that we're going to send to Africa has to be bought here in the United States. So what does that mean? 3 times as more costly to do it than buying it locally.
And it means another subsidy for those who are able to meet that quota.
Right.
I mean, I'm guessing you're going to have to be pretty big to plug into that.
Of course. Okay, here again, American Enterprise Institute. A new Soviet-style program in this bill at taxpayer expense would guarantee milk producers a minimum margin between the revenue they receive for their milk and their estimated costs that they incur for their cow feed. There's a cotton subsidy, which violates the World Trade Organization's rules, which means we have to pay, as a government, $150 million a year to Brazil because we're violating those rules to subsidize the cotton farming in the United States.
But we'd rather do that than run afoul of the milk lobby in this case.
Or absolutely, or the cotton. Evidently, cotton always makes out.
But I mean, I understand the argument that, food production is not no economic venture is risk-free, but food production is both critical. You've got to have a reliable, steady supply of food, and you're also dealing with tremendous uncertainty, flood conditions, drought, insects. I mean, wind can come and knock an entire crop over. Who knows what the problem
right,
could be?
But
so there should be some way of assuring some viability in the case of a bad year or 2 or 3.
That's what crop insurance is for. So what does the new bill give? 75% of the crop insurance cost is covered by you, the American taxpayer. And even though the insuring entities and the farmers that make out on this want to say, well, we paid $4 billion in premiums on our crop insurance, they got paid $16 billion back that same year. And what are they guaranteeing? They're guaranteeing them that we will pay you if your yield falls below 95% of what you predict. It used to be in the 70s. Now it's 95% they get paid.
So they're going to get paid one way or the other in all likelihood.
I mean, there's 20,000 sugar farmers in the United States. Do we really need to have this many people producing sugar in the United States? Is it such a great nutrient in our diet?
I'd rather have 100,000 people producing sugar and have them be smaller farms.
Well, nevertheless, there's 20,000 producers, and they collect on the old sugar policy, they collect $1.7 billion a year on subsidies, cost the American people $3 billion a year on higher prices.
And we're talking beet sugar.
Beet sugar in general.
Which actually is a lot better for you than corn syrup.
Sugar.
Well, no, it's
okay, what about the conservation programs, which would be good in the Farm Bill? Gutted, right?
Yeah.
Research, which pays well beyond its cost, gutted in this Farm Bill. It's such a clear-cut handout to a small number of farmers. The average farmer, 80% of the farmers in the United States, get $5,000 or less from the Farm Bill.
So do you?
And what about the $10 billion still being spent to pay people not to grow anything? What is that about?
See, I could not get that subsidy because I grow between 1/4 and 1/2 ton of food every year. I'm serious.
Yeah.
Between my hens and my 1,000 square feet of gardening.
Right.
I'm a fairly big little farmer.
Well, but it's the weirdest thing because you have people who are farmers coming up and saying this bill is horrendous. all it does is it's basically handing money from the U.S. Treasury to agribusiness to no purpose. It doesn't increase our food security. It does nothing. And yet, why doesn't somebody just cut the 20, 40 billion out of this?
Now, do you see any significant distinction between the U.S. House Republicans and the Senate-controlled Democrats on this issue?
I mean, the Senate Democrats are committed to not having food stamps gutted, but they are equally committed to keeping the Farm Bill as it is.
And do you see more support for maintaining some of the conservation programs in the Senate than in the House?
Yes, but and the bill that the Senate passed only cut $4 billion from the food stamp program.
Yeah,
and they did that by closing a loophole.
As opposed to Steve King's $20 billion.
Correct.
Yeah.
And well, actually, no. The total that the Republicans now want is $39 billion because
the poor haven't been lobbying
well,
hard
no,
enough to keep that.
They upped the ante when they decided to separate the bills.
Oh, right,
Because
sure.
it was originally $20 million, then they upped
well, then
it to $19 billion.
there was nothing holding them to try to preserve that coalition at that point.
Right. I mean, they passed the bill, both bills in the House, totally on partisan lines.
Well, I know that some people argue that this is important because poverty is an issue we should be concerned about, but some of the arguments in defense of food stamps just totally ignore the poor and appeal to our perennial passion for doing things that are good for the economy. Think of all the small businesses that will be hurt by the money no longer going into the local economy through the food stamp program.
In fact, that was the reason initially that the Obama administration expanded food stamps, because they looked at it as a way to quickly get money into the economy.
Yeah.
Because people go out and buy food. It's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, isn't food stamps a subsidy of farmers and food producers?
Okay.
It creates a market that happens to be distributed to a large number of people.
Given the type of food available and what's probably being purchased, it's more of a subsidy for food processors than farmers.
Well, they are part of the agribusiness. That's correct.
Right, yeah.
But I mean, that's the point, which I don't understand why people don't see that food stamps are nothing more than another form of subsidy to those who produce.
Well, I got a lot of mail on this, folks, and maybe we can share some of it with you. This is from Louis, not Louis Armstrong, different Louis. Food stamps are easily and often abused. Let me start with that.
Totally untrue.
Yeah, food stamps, it used to be easier to abuse. Here we are calling it food stamps, Charles. We really ought to get out of the 1990s here and in with the program. It's now the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and it's a card. It's like a credit card, an EBT card.
Which is also very interesting because the credit card, of course, was brought into being because it makes money for the processor of those credit cards.
Right.
So there's another little bit of overhead, which no one seems to be particularly concerned about, which is that the banks that handle the debit card, of course, accrue a fair amount in fees because they handle this, basically, doing the money laundering.
Well, Louis goes on to say that that food stamps are a chain to keeping people poor, and I'm like he turned that one on its head.
Well,
I mean,
if you're feeding children, I'm not sure exactly what is it people want. People, I guess they say, well, everyone should go out and work.
Well, here's what he says. Louis says, people will not take better jobs as they will lose their food stamp benefits, thus making them worse off as the food stamps are not taxable income and earning more money is taxed. So, yeah. He says, comparing food stamps to a military job is extremely insulting.
Well, that's not what you were doing. You were saying that that a military job, basically a low-level enlisted person in the military with a large family, doesn't make enough money to feed their family.
He says one is paying for services rendered, and the other is a handout. No single healthy person should be eligible for food stamps. They should be working.
Well, this is my suggestion, Ed. From now on, anybody who writes in has to state their age, whether they are on Medicare or they get Social Security. And then we can see, let's level the playing field when we talk about handouts.
Yeah. Well, where else do you want to go with this?
Well, what I'd like to go with it is to ask, we've become such a mean-spirited country. And I don't understand why people think, the same people who say that we need to be economically responsible and we need to reduce the debt, why does it have to be on the backs of people who are already suffering? I don't know why people think that getting welfare is some lavish life.
Yeah, because we can't actually try to reduce the deficit by taking a chunk out of the one area of the budget that comprises almost 60% of discretionary spending.
What, the NFL? Football? I'm sorry, the military.
No, the military. But, good guess. Good guess, Charles. Yeah, no, the military budget is close to 60% of discretionary spending.
Right.
You can't just tweak a little bit out of the school lunch program or pick your favorite little, pork project even. I mean, I'm not a fan of pork barrel spending, but look at the military budget is the lion's share of discretionary spending.
Well, but interestingly,
And Simpson Bowles took a little shot at it, but that's the only serious discussion I've heard about reducing military spending was Simpson Bowles.
But interestingly, if you step back from the military budget, I think it's an easy target. But understand two things about the military budget. A huge amount of the military budget now goes to paying people pensions. So that is actually a retirement security for a large number of people in this country. The second thing is, as you saw with the government shutdown, there's a huge number of people who work for the military. The military, both in terms of being an active duty member, in terms of being a civilian, is a works project. It creates jobs.
Right.
The problem you have with the military is when you spend billions on some weapon system that doesn't work, or
that we go off on foreign adventures that just exacerbate our national security issues and wreak havoc on someone else's planet or corner their planet.
No, I mean, that's true. But I think you also have to be cautious about where you're going to cut your spending. Whether we like it or not, I mean, what are the two biggest industries in the United States? The military is number one, medicine's number two. And these are huge economic multipliers. What we don't like is money that's handed to the same people over and over again to do nothing except actually increase the price of our goods or undercut our trade partners. As somebody pointed out, who is a Republican representative who has a farm in Elkhart, Indiana, he says, this is the worst thing we could do for international security. Because if we continue to subsidize our prices to be artificially low on the international market, how is a third world country ever going to compete with that? They're going to be a third world country for the rest of our lives. Well, that's great if you like your shirts cheap from Bangladesh, but have a little humanity.
Yeah, an occasional factory collapse and the death of 1,000, young workers is just the price we have to pay, I guess, for cheap T-shirts.
Why are people so enamored of the rich in this country? Why do they think they've earned this?
Well, let me ask you this. This is a letter from Steve. Says, I hope your answer to the question, why the contempt for food stamps, includes the probability that people who despise help for the needy, whether food stamps or something else, are sociopaths. He says, I don't say this lightly. I'm a therapist who has studied this. Being a sociopath means a person has no conscience and no empathy or compassion. Is that a little harsh?
No. I mean, the word, obviously, people are going to listen to this and say that we're going off the deep end as usual about the Tea Party and the Republicans.
Hey, speak for yourself.
But, I mean, he's using the word in a correct sense. There's a lack of empathy. And at what point, we're supposed to be an educated people. Look at what we allow to exist in our own country. But look at what goes on in other countries. And how much are we responsible to this? Is it really that important that somebody, I mean, we have these shows in which we see celebrities, living in the Hamptons and throwing these huge parties and basically drinking alcohol all day.
Kind of like you and I living in Sherman Hill and West Des Moines.
What is it that's so desirable about that?
Yeah.
Why are we protecting this?
Yeah.
And, a lot of these people, they grew up in wealth. They inherited wealth. Yes, of course, there are plenty of people who made their way. But there's plenty of people who didn't. And I don't know why we're in such reverence to these people. And every time we vilify everybody who doesn't, or ask a basic question. What happens when you make people so desperate because they can't eat that they're willing to be violent? In some sense, you're buying social order. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you live out in some rich enclave, you've got your own private security. But most of us don't. And most of us are going to rely on what law enforcement or what army of occupation we have. And I don't know why people don't see this. You can't make people hopeless and desperate. Eventually, they will come and take it from you.
And let me ask you, is that where we're heading? Is the polarization in our country heading us in that direction?
I think you're seeing elements of that. I'm surprised that we don't see more violence. Look back in the 60s. The spread between wealth and the rest of us was not that as great by any sense.
There was quite a bit of unrest and a lot of uprising back then.
Right. I mean, you had two things coming together. You had a white middle class children who were going to a war, and then you had, of course, the civil rights movement. But I'm surprised, in fact, at the calm in this country right now. Obviously, somehow we're anesthetizing people to what's going on. But I really think you have to ask yourself, if you're so against food stamps and welfare, what are those people going to do when they have nothing? nothing to fall back on.
Well, then we'll have to tell them to eat cake. And the last time
That worked out well.
The last time someone was told to eat cake, it did not
some
go
heads
very well.
rolled after
There
that.
were heads rolling. Anyway, that I hope it doesn't come to that. But anyway, it's a good conversation. One I wish more people would have. And again, I will try to share more of the emails I received on this. Again, some of them get it. Meaning they agree with me and Charles. Some people don't at all, and some people have mixed feelings about it. And I respect all those views, but we're running out of time on that, folks. So we'll have to share that at some other point. I do want to remind you that if you're listening on KHOI or KPVL, the second half of this program will be a conversation about climate change, about the raging wildfires in Australia, and also looking back at Hurricane Sandy's 1-year anniversary. What's happened since then? Are there still people suffering? And what are the lessons on climate change regarding that? And we'll also take a look at the big vote coming up here in Polk County. Yeah, I know folks up in other parts of the state may not care, but this is an interesting conversation. Does Iowa's largest county need to spend $81 million to renovate the court facilities? We'll talk about that in the second half of the program for those listening on KHOI and KPVL 89.1 FM. I want to thank all of you who stood around for the conversation today. I want to thank Ron for calling in. I want to thank all of our business supporters, the Gateway Market and Cafe. Gateway Market is one of my best allies, folks. They're at 20th and Woodland. Please support them. They've got a great grocery store, and they're a wonderful place for breakfast, lunch, and supper. I want to thank one of my newest business partners, N-Touch Therapy Services. That's Kim Foley's business. She's a massage and physical therapist. Give her a shout at 979-8629. $40 for first-time customers for a full-body, hour-long massage. I want to thank Hawk Restaurant, H-O-Q, Hawk Restaurant, at East 5th and Walnut in the East Village, where 90% of the food comes from local sources. I want to thank Community CPA and Associates at 3816 Ingersoll Ave. They're now Iowa's 10th largest accounting firm. Ritual Cafe at 13th and Locust, another one of our supporters. Ritual Cafe, great place for tea, coffee, smoothies, paninis, and music on the weekends. Tally's Restaurant, Bar, and Catering. Yes, the catering part. Do not forget to check out Tally's for catering. Also open for lunch and supper, and on Sundays, a great Sunday brunch. Remind you about the upcoming Immigrant Entrepreneur Summit. That's happening at Drake University on November 9th. The IES, as it's known, is in its 5th or 6th year now. I think 6th year. And about 400 people showed up last year. 100 good business ideas came out of this. You can register for only $35 online at IESUSA.org. I also want to thank the Fighting Burrito, where I had lunch today, and I discovered, Charles, you like this, Mr. Gluten-Free, that you can actually have a great burrito at Fighting Burrito
in a bowl.
In a bowl. It was really good. Actually. It was just as good. I want to thank Diana's Wedding Cakes out of Newton. I want to thank Live by Liz. This is a service provided by Liz George, and it's a great way to figure out how to lead a healthy life, especially targeting women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. I want to thank Maddie Kane, my producer, Webcast One Live for providing the studio, and the Iowa chapter of the Sierra Club, and Iowa Physicians for Social Responsibility. I'll be back tomorrow.